This is week 36. Ego, friend, or foe? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it and your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Jesus Christ begins his Beatitudes with the words, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." To be poor in spirit in such a way as to merit the kingdom of heaven does not mean to be poor-spirited. Rather, it means to see oneself as owning nothing, since all belongs to God, for all is a manifestation of his consciousness. St. John of the Cross wrote, "If you would own everything, seek to own nothing. That which the ego relinquishes, offering it up to soul consciousness, is reclaimed forever in cosmic consciousness. Nothing is ever lost." Paramhansa Yogananda tells the story in Autobiography of a Yogi of the levitating saint Badura Mahashaya. "Master," said a disciple of the saint once ardently, "you are wonderful. You have renounced riches and comforts to seek God and teach us wisdom." It was well known that Baduri Mahasaya had forsaken great family wealth in his early childhood, when single-mindedly he entered the yogic path. "You are reversing the case." The saint's face held mild rebuke. "I have left a few paltry rupees, a few petty pleasures for a cosmic empire of endless bliss. How then have I denied myself anything? I know the joy of sharing the treasure. Is that a sacrifice?" The short-sighted worldly folk are verily the real renunciates. They relinquish an unparalleled divine possession for a poor handful of earthly toys. The Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter states, "All things are everywhere by nature wrought, in interaction of the qualities. The fool, cheated by self, thinks, 'This I did, and that I wrought. But thou strong-armed prince, a better lessoned mind, knowing the play of visible things within the world of sense, and how the qualities must qualify, standeth aloof even from his acts.'" Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om. Om.
Good morning, everyone. We have Anastra here today visiting us from Maine. Welcome. It's nice to see you. Okay. So we'll start out with a reading from Whispers from Eternity, Yogananda's book of prayer, poems, and demands. And today we'll be reading number 147. Demand not to be enslaved by the ego or by ego-centered passivity. I want to use my own will, but guide it ever, Father, toward the golden paradise of all fulfillment. For I would be infinity's smiling child, confident of being imprisoned no longer behind bars of fruitless desire and withered hopes. I would break the shameful cords of lethargy that have presumed to hold me and stepped fearlessly into freedom. Released, I now blaze my way through forests of every limitation and delusion. Oh, my little vain ego may strut proudly saying, "Behold my glory, worship me." But I will look through its transparent form and behold thine unimaginable beauty clothed in the subtle form of the whole universe. The silence-tuned hearing of my soul We'll ignore that tiny boasting masquerader, my little self impersonating thee, and will listen rapturously to the wind-born, fragrant music of thine own matchless voice whispering across the ages, I am he. Wow, that little boasting masquerader. I love that image. Master has a way with words, doesn't he? Sorry, let me put these over here. So today we get to talk about the ego, everybody's favorite subject. And Master said that the ego is simply the soul identified with the physical body. And, you know, this physical form that we identify with so dearly is just a little temporary house. It's just a temporary vehicle for our soul to travel through this lifetime on this planet at this time in history. And soon enough, it'll disappear. This physical body will be gone, but our soul, our eternal nature, our eternal essence, that part of us that is the spark of God, that lives on forever. And as we know in this tradition, we'll probably come back again and try it all over again. So it's important not to be too attached. Swami Kriyananda described the ego as a bundle of self-definitions. And think about all the ways that we define ourselves, our gender, our race, our ethnicity, what we believe in, the foods we like to eat, the foods we don't like to eat, whether we're conservative or liberal. The list goes on and on and on. And all of these little definitions create a bundle of energy, and that bundle of energy becomes who we are, becomes our personality. And the whole point, Swami Kriyananda said, of the spiritual path is to begin to transcend all of these definitions of who we are. The I thought is so powerful, isn't it? It's an incredible thing. I am this, I am that. There's a practice I like to do once in a while where I try not to use the word I for a day, and it's so difficult because we just keep going back to ourselves, our own wants, our own needs, our own desires. There was a practice that I heard Swami Kriyananda mention once in a talk that was going around when I was a teenager, and it must have been from a book about meditation, and maybe some of you have tried it, where you look in the mirror and you say, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And I did this when I was a teenager for about 30 or 40 minutes. And what it starts to do, it really starts to break down that definition. You start to have a different perception of who you are. And when it happened, I started to feel really uncomfortable. And then at a certain point, I became filled with fear, almost like a terror. And I had to stop, because that's what the ego does. The ego wants us to really stay rooted in the consciousness that we are this person. We're this visual group of cells, basically, or energy. But it's such an interesting thing to do that, to just kind of really question. And there's a couple of really fun party games you can play with your ego. And there's none more powerful than listening to or watching a news outlet that has a viewpoint that's different than your own, right? Especially now with what's going on in the world. And when you do that, I know when I do that, I can find myself getting really angry and sometimes even shouting at the TV or the newspaper. And it's such an interesting thing when that happens. And you have to stop and say, wait a minute, who's angry? Who's angry? It's not my soul that's angry. It's my bundle of definitions. It's that part of myself that identifies with a certain stream of consciousness. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong, but it's just something to really start to question. And it's a good way to try to tame the ego a little bit and just to try to be neutral, because everyone has an opinion, you know, and basically that's what we're listening to when we take in, you know, other people's opinions. That's what we do all day long. And the most powerful thing we can do is tune into God's voice within our own soul. And that's why we meditate. That's the point of our practices, is that to quiet out all those voices, just release them and get deep into our own hearts. At work, we just had to do a training. We do all these trainings every year online. And the new one we're doing is called unconscious bias. Now, we know This is a huge subject in the last 2 years because of Black Lives Matters and the Me Too movement and all the people in the world seeking refuge because of natural disasters, war, violence. And it triggers a lot for people. And unconscious bias is something within us that we're not even aware of. And the thing that stuck out the most for me in this training was this fact that we process over 11,000 bits of information every minute through our sensory organs. So the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, the skin, the touch, we get all this information, but our brain can only process 40 bits of information per minute. Now that's a staggering discrepancy, isn't it? So essentially that means that 99.9% of the time, everything is going into the subconscious mind. And that's where unconscious bias comes from. And the ego spends a lot of time in the subconscious, to be honest. So as yogis, we're always trying to be aware, consciously aware of our thoughts, our deeds, our actions. And even with our best intentions, the subconscious mind and the ego are always sending us these other messages to try to pull us back. You know, it happens even with something simple. I'm not going to eat that cookie. But then the little subconscious says, but it tastes so good and you love chocolate and it's got peanut butter in it and it's okay, just have one. You know, that's just a silly example, but it happens all day long with big things too, big decisions, big things we're trying to overcome. So just something to remember, you know, we're kind of fighting that all the time. And the way out of this is simply through God consciousness. The more time we focus on God, through meditation, through prayer, through chanting, through japa, the more we fill our mind with an image of God, the thought of God, the name of God, and any of its manifestations, that keeps us in a different place. It kind of secures us and sort of protects us in a way from all of this subconscious information and the ego that's always trying to pull us away. Today from the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. To be poor in spirit just means to release the ego. In the ancient language, I don't know if it was Aramaic, basically spirit and ego kind of have the same meaning. So that's really the meaning of that, to just sort of work on releasing all of those self-definitions and all of those likes and dislikes and attachments that we basically cling on to. And the Beatitudes, for those of us that were raised Catholic, or Christian, if you have a Bible at home, the Beatitudes come from the Sermon of the Mount, which is recorded in chapters 5 through 7 of the book of Matthew, which is quite short, but it's the longest discourse we have on record of Jesus's direct words to his disciples. And it pretty much makes up the entire message of Christianity. So it's kind of interesting to read it. And the story of this is that Jesus was traveling with his disciples, and it was in the beginning of his ministry, the early days, and he was starting to attract throngs of crowds, throngs of people. So he went up onto the mountain and just took his disciples with him, and the others were down below. And he spoke directly to his disciples of these truths, of the Beatitudes, because he knew that they had the ears to hear. They had the soul intuition to receive the message. And, you know, during his time on earth, he really smashed a lot of unconscious bias in his disciples and in all of his followers, like the relationship to women, the relationships to the chosen ones, who were God's people. You know, he was with lepers and prostitutes and all the undesirable people, you know, so he really did a lot to kind of open people's consciousness and get them out of these sort of ego-centered thought patterns. And they weren't using that language in that day, but his vibration and his message was having that effect on people, which is really, really powerful. So basically the entire Sermon of the Mount and all of the Beatitudes are taking us from ego consciousness to Christ consciousness. You know, Christ was offering an expanded awareness of reality. There, in today's story about Baduri Mahashaya, if you read the chapter, which I know you all have because of the book club, the levitating saint, Master lived around the corner and he spent quite a bit of time there as a boy. And one of the things that Baduri said to him was that it's more important to love God than to meditate, because he knew that Master already as a child was very deep into meditation. And the reason he said that to him was because when we have the thought, I am a meditator, I am a Kriyaban, that's another self-definition, and it kind of locks us in. And he didn't want Master to forget that it's our devotion to God that is supreme, and it's our devotion to God that guides the meditation, that helps transcend all of these things. It's so interesting going back to the I thought, because Master gave us an I thought to transcend the ego. He gave us Hong Sa, which is I am spirit. And by repeating that over and over and over, it's kind of like looking in the mirror and saying, who am I? It starts to open the brain. It starts to transcend the brain in that thought pattern. And the more time we spend in our heart, again, the more time we spend in our heart, the energy of the Anahata chakra, the heart energy, it bypasses the mind and the intellect, and it brings us into a different relationship with spirit. One thing that Bhaduri used to say to his followers was, place yourself and keep yourself within the divine circle. Now, this was in reference to a story about Sita and the demon Ravana. So Sita and Ram's brother Lakshman, it's part of the Mahabharata and it's part of a bigger story, but this one little part of the story, they had ran away into the forest. They were seeking refuge, and Ram and Lakshman built Sita a little ashram in the forest. And the demon, there were lots of demons and nefarious people in the forest. And the demon Ravana had seen Sita and fallen in love with her beauty, and he wanted her for himself. So he devised a plan. He got one of his little deputy demons, who was named Marisha, to take the form of a golden deer. And when Sita saw this golden deer frolicking in the woods, its fur was glistening, it had little silver spots, and its eyes were like emeralds, she was overcome with desire to possess this little animal. So she said to Ram, you must go out and bring the deer back to me, dead or alive. If you bring it alive, he'll be my pet. If you bring it dead, I'll sit on his skin and I'll rule the forest from that perch. So Ram went out, but before he left, he said to Lakshman, do not leave Sita alone. No matter what you do, you can't leave Sita. And Lakshman made that promise to his brother that he wouldn't leave Sita. So Ram went out in the woods and he shot the deer with his arrow. And when he did, the demon Marisha took form and mimicked Ram's voice and cried out to Sita and Lakshman, come help me. When Sita heard that, of course, she was so afraid that Ram was in danger that she implored Lakshman to go out and save him. And Lakshman said, oh, I made a promise to my brother that I wouldn't leave you. So he took his arrow and he drew a circle in the dirt around Sita's hut. And he said, whatever you do, do not cross this line. Promise me. She said, okay, I won't. So we know where this is going. So Lakshman ran out into the woods to help save Ram. And just a short time later, the great demon Ravana took the form of an ancient, aging sadhu. And he came and he sat by the base of a tree facing Sita. And he said, please, won't you help me? I'm hungry. I need water. I need food. And so Sita went in the house and got a little bowl of food and some water, and she put it right over the line. And then he said, oh, but I can't move. You must bring it to me. And her soul wisdom, that intuitive voice within, said, don't cross the line. But she did. And we know the story that ancient sadhu turned into the demon Ravana and grabbed her, kidnapped her, put her on his chariot and took her away. So what Bhadari Mahashaya used to say to his disciples was, never step out of the divine circle drawn by God's consciousness. And he said, or will be carried away by evil, immortality, and all the tricks of the ego. And the ego is a trickster. That's the bottom line. It's very devious. And in this story, it was Sita's ego who wanted possession of this little deer. Instead of just admiring this beautiful creature, she had to own it. And that's what the ego does to us, right? We see things and we want them, little baubles, a new car, a new dress, some type of food, whatever it is. There's a million things to tempt us every day. And we have to learn to resist those temptations and see what they are. It's the ego coming in to trick us out of God consciousness, that circle of God's light. And the other part of this story is that the sadhu in this tale represents the ego's way of making us believe in the illusion of the material world. So that was an illusion that Sita, she didn't listen to the soul voice within. Instead, she took the illusion of ego and went out of the circle. So, the ego can hypnotize us. We know that. And we have to just be really cautious to stay in God's circle of consciousness, God's circle of light. Swami Kriyananda in Sadhu Beware teaches us how to be an ego detective. So he said that our ego consciousness, as we know, is centered in the medulla oblongata at the base of the spine, the base of the scalp. And whenever we are in a situation where the ego is stimulated, tension builds there. So that can be a little headache. It can be the shoulders lifting up, tension in the back. We've all had those feelings. And we can also feel the ego stimulation in the heart. When the heart is restless with emotion, we feel ego stimulation in the mind when we're going back and forth about trying to make a decision. And part of it is because we're so stuck on our one way of looking at things. And so Swami Kriyananda says, just to become aware of that, and then close your eyes and bring your awareness back to the medulla, and then consciously relax and release that energy to the spiritual eye and offer it up to God. So that's a little practice we can try whenever we find ourselves in that ego delusion or that bind. As we become more centered in God, we can pick up on those things quicker and quicker. We can kind of name it a little bit quicker, which is really powerful. So basically, when we meditate or focus on the spiritual eye, all of that ego consciousness falls away. Yogananda told us that if we did nothing else on this path, but kept our awareness here, we would still transcend ego consciousness in this lifetime. But he gave us Kriya Yoga, he gave us Hang Sa, he gave us japa and chanting, he gave us all of these amazing techniques that take the heart energy and bring it up here, and then we offer it to God. So just remember, we want to keep ourselves in this protective circle of God's consciousness. And when you think about it, the spiritual eye is a little circle, isn't it? So we can think of it that way, just keeping ourselves in this protective circle of God's consciousness, and nothing can harm us.